Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching a brand new edition of India's World with me, Frank Rausan Pereira. Seeking to reset ties, Prime Minister Narendra Modi and his Nepalese counterpart KP Sharma Oli on Saturday held wide-ranging talks and vowed to step up overall engagement and take the relationship to newer heights on the basis of equality, mutual trust and respect. After the delegation-level talks, Modi said that India will always stand by Nepal in its quest for all-round growth, asserting that deeper cooperation between the two neighbors will strengthen democracy in Nepal. In his press statement, Oli, who is seen as favouring a closer relationship with China, said his government wants to build a strong edifice of trust-based relationship between the two nations. On this edition of India's World, we will analyse where the bilateral relationship between India and Nepal is headed. Joining me on the program today are Professor S.T. Muni, Foreign Affairs expert, Shiv Shankar Mukerjee, former ambassador to Nepal, and Mallika Shakya, Assistant Professor, South Asian University. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of India's World. Professor, I'd like to begin with you. What do you think were the takeaways from Prime Minister KP Sharma Oli's visit to India?
The takeaway was that they would not have any new agreement. They haven't had, except for those three agreements on rail, which are the issues coming for a long time being discussed. The real takeaway would, let me quote a English saying that the taste of pudding is in the eating. So much would depend upon what really happens now onwards. That the kind of commitments they have made to each other and the assurances which have been given are honored and stuck to. And that's a difficult area. We can discuss it. So takeaway is that yes, we have forgotten at the governmental level, forgotten the past, but there is no change in Mr. Oli's assertive tone that we will do our foreign policy in a manner they want, and they would expect India to respect and honor in whatever they do. The critical area is, of course, how they handle their relations with other neighbors like Pakistan and China, how they handle the internal balance, because there was an innocuous reference in the joint statement of both the countries helping build federal institutions and federalism in Nepal. Now, federalism is new in Nepal and therefore they will need a lot of economic and technical assistance also. But in addition to that, federal issue also incorporates the Madeshi issue, which was not otherwise spelled out. And every impression was given that Madesh issue is forgotten. But I think this is where it comes in, and therefore there are sensitive issues which it depends upon how they are being handled now onwards.
Sure. You know, going forward, India needs to be very careful in dealing with Nepal is what the professor is suggesting. Ambassador, what were the highlights for you?
Well, I would agree completely with what Professor Muni said, but what I'd like to add is the visit must be seen in the context in which it is happening. It is happening about 10 years after the first elections to the Constituent Assembly. Since that time, in these 10 years, we've had all sorts of ups and downs internally in Nepal, a series of unstable governments, maybe in 10 years, more than 10 prime ministers, coalitions building up and falling apart like musical chairs. We've had the earthquake in Nepal that was a huge setback in every way for that country. We've had and more importantly, in the context of this visit, we've had in the last 2 years a bunch of misunderstandings between the two countries that actually soured relations. Most of all, the blockade on the border, which was blamed totally on India by the people of Nepal in general and by the present Prime Minister Oli in particular, who made a huge amount of electoral capital out of making India the scapegoat for all the hardships that followed that blockade. To me, the main political takeaway from this is that both sides seem to have agreed, as Mr. Muni said, to have put that in the past, to give signals that both realize the importance each has for each other, and put these misunderstandings and these glitches behind them, and go on the path towards a really genuine cooperative relationship.
Sure.
I mean, we all talk about the unique relationship and so on and so forth that India and Nepal have, but to actually concretely translate that into action with a series of high-profile projects that have been hanging fire for some time, including some new ones.
Sure.
As far as implementation is concerned, which was pointed out, that is, of course, crucial because, I mean, for years and years and years, all of us who watch Nepal, who've dealt with Nepal, who've lived in Nepal, we know that the amount of goodwill that India should be the recipient of in terms of the projects that we do, in terms of the huge amount of development cooperation, which is genuinely has helped Nepal over the years, it does not really come about because of the sheer glacial pace at which implementation takes place.
Sure.
So
as
yes,
far as projects
politically, a good visit, and where it goes in the future depends on implementation. The Madheshi issue was quietly shelved, but it is not going away.
Okay, the Madhesi issue is not going away. That's something that may crop up in the near future is what you're suggesting. But implementation of projects is key going forward is what both the speakers have said thus far. Let me bring in the third speaker now, Mallika. As far as the ties are concerned, this word reset was used a lot over the last 1 week. Have we been successful in resetting the ties?
I would like to say that maybe resetting the ties itself is not a one-time process. It's a gradual process, but the place that the current Prime Minister comes from with a very strong and clear democratic mandate, but also a very stable government to go ahead with the constitution in place, federal structure now evolving slowly, and the past People's War now firmly behind. Now with these three factors, I think it probably can look into a place of political stability which is necessary for resetting any ties or correcting the courses on many parts.
Sure, Professor, several barriers were created, like the ambassador pointed out, over the last 10 years or so. Ties have soured between India and Nepal. Do you believe this visit has been successful in breaching some of those barriers?
No, I think this visit has said that we intend to breach these barriers, or we want to resolve the issues which created misunderstanding in the past. Now, my fear is, and this is where many people say I am looking negatively, but I think I am looking more realistically. There were 2 points on Mr. Oli's side which rattled 3 points which rattled India, and there were 3 points which rattled Mr. Oli on the other side. What Oli felt that India was interfering in his affairs, and that India was asking for a balanced constitution, whereas he thought he had a right to frame a constitution, or Nepal had a right to frame a constitution which it wanted, whether the minorities or other groups are all inclusive or not, despite all the promises made. The second was that he had been very greatly puffed up by using the China factor. Now, these are the 2 issues which have not gone very well with India, in the sense that if nationalism of Nepal is being used against India, then it hits at the very roots of India-Nepal relations, because that is how we have not been looking at it. Nepal is not an adversary. Nobody in India wants to have any harm done to Nepal in one way or the other. And secondly, if China uses its economic and infrastructure projects to encroach upon India's what you call a strategic presence, then it is not acceptable to Delhi. Now, whether Mr. Oli will be able to come out of these 2, firstly, and secondly, if he does not, whether India would be able to still do business with him and tolerate Nepal either being very assertively nationalist against India or banking too much of China. And these are the critical factors in terms of how the polity and the decisions evolve now, both on Indian side as also on the Nepalese side.
Is the anti-India rhetoric going to be raked up again?
Well, it was very clearly evident even during Mr. Oli's visit. For instance, there are many people, even now, after he has gone back to Kathmandu, some of the media reports said, why did he not raise the currency issue? Why did he not raise the 1950 issue? Why did he not assert, insist on the trade deficit being put into the joint communique? And this kind of tone is still, it is very much visible. Therefore, to take this constituency away, which incidentally, both China and the nationalist constituency have been the source of power for Mr. Oli. So, whether Mr. Oli would be able to distance from these profiles, I am just keeping fingers crossed and hoping that he musters courage, he recalls his own vision, and he recalls the better interest of both the Nepalese and the Indians to see that a more rational approach is being adopted.
Sure, sure. You know, Ambassador, Professor brought up the China card, and you know, this is something that the Nepalese have played all throughout. Is there some scope for cooperation for India and China in Nepal?
Look, it all depends on political will. I think, as was very clearly pointed out by Professor Muni, it is a choice that Prime Minister Oli has to face much more than India, as a matter of fact. I mean, he has come to power with the backing of nationalism is equal to anti-Indianism kind of rhetoric, and not ideology, but a kind of feeling that has been drilled into the population in Nepal right from the times of the monarchy followed by the Ranas. It was very easy and therefore frequently used by them for all the failings of their own governments, for the fact that Nepal under the Rana rule and the Shah rule remained one of the most backward countries in the world, misgoverned totally, was to equate all their ills with the scapegoat that was Big Brother India. That we were all very familiar with it. Educated Nepalis are also familiar with it. So to that extent, I would say let's be a little careful about overreacting to anti-Indian rhetoric, because that has always been used by political circles in Nepal to garner cheap popularity, instant popularity. There's some basis for this, because a tiny country sandwiched between two Asian giants naturally has sensitivities if it wants its sovereignty and its independence intact, to be able to deal with. To that extent, let's give them their due. But coming straight to present times and Prime Minister Oli, he has the choice of either completely tailoring his policies to maintain the goodwill of his nationalist constituency, taking all the help that he can get from China, which will be willingly given the recent aggressiveness and assertiveness of China's policy itself.
But in that, will Nepal, face the risk of turning into a new Sri Lanka?
Or the other choice, that's a different matter. Or the other choice, the other alternative, which is to realize, and that's an absolute fact, which is incontrovertible, that development in Nepal, economic development in Nepal, prosperity in Nepal, peace and stability in Nepal is far more dependent on its equation with India than with this chimera of breaching the Himalayas and having the kind of relationship with China that they already have historically with India. Geography simply cannot be denied. I am absolutely sure from my years in Nepal that the leadership realizes this, but for temporary political compulsions, they choose to ignore it. So we will have to see with what maturity and reason and good sense Prime Minister Oli approaches. If he is basing his policies on, politicking and staying in power with the kind of constituency that he has and has nurtured, in which anti-Indian rhetoric and scapegoating India forms a kind of a core,
It seems to
then
be
I don't think much is going to happen which is positive in terms of Nepal's development or Indo-Nepal relations.
Sure.
I'm still optimistic because, as I said, the leadership knows that if they genuinely want Nepal to progress, friendship with India is the best option, knowing that India means absolutely no harm to Nepal at all. I mean, we've got 6 to 8 million Nepalis working in India. We guarantee the exchange rate of the Nepali rupee.
Sure. Mallika, but do the Nepalese believe that friendship with India is the right option or the best option? Because at the end of the day, the anti-India rhetoric seems to be getting a lot of traction on the ground in Nepal.
I feel that I think the people in Nepal, and that is reflected in some of the statements that have been made by the leadership as well. I think it shows a realization that the current government, but also the current party, the UML and the Maoist kind of merger of the party, stands on a series of anomalies. So ideologically, they haven't fully resolved the differences between CPN UML's version of left ideology and Prajannapat, and there's a huge difference between the two. But also more practical and pragmatic matters like TRC. In a way, the Nepali Congress and Maoists have fought the war, and so as the state party and the opponent, they have been both guilty of several war crimes that UML who has stayed in opposition throughout the People's War, would be keen to go after, right? So that is some developmental and fundamental issues that they haven't hammered out. So I think Oli himself realizes that he's standing on thin ice, although he has clear electoral mandate, right? Within this, I feel that broader population of Nepal is also kind of realizing that it's giving the current government a benefit of doubt and a certain kind of reconciliatory act, including the whole range of Madeshis that was pointed out later, but also the Janajatis, the women, the Dalits who have had fierce opposition against the UML's version of new nationalism, you know. So all of these are taken into factor. So there's a lot of pragmatism within the country. But I would feel that in terms of thinking about whether the stance now would be anti-India or pro-India, it probably is best seen at least in the regional context, if not global. On one hand, I would say China today is actually quite different from China a decade ago or 2 decades ago. And that's not necessarily only because Nepal has taken a different policy vis-a-vis China. China itself has asserted itself very vocally globally as well. But in the meantime, I think in front of India, there is an opportunity to come up with a kind of developmental imagination that would benefit not only Nepal as a small neighbor, but also other small neighbors who are also emerging from a long conflict. I mean, Afghanistan, Sri Lanka, you know, does India as the biggest country in the region has an alternative developmental imagination that is suitable for small countries in the neighborhood which are coming out of very, very long and very, very difficult kind of war-like trajectories. And so the onus is as much on India as on Nepal to come up with an alternative South Asian vision on reconciliation and development.
Sure. And what is this alternative going to be, Professor, going forward? Because you did mention about projects, you did mention about how the delivery of the projects has been extremely slow, it's moved at a snail's pace. Can we see that picking up now going forward?
Well, the intention is, and I think intention was articulated by all the Prime Ministers to Nepal, particularly by Prime Minister Narendra Modi when he went there in 2014. He said he would expedite all the projects. You would recall that he even put some timelines on some of the projects, and they have not been delivered. And mind it, when Mr. Oli came, he reminded the Prime Minister, you know, he gave a formula of HIT, highways, information ways and transportation ways. And he said, you gave this vision to us of connectivity and it remains where it was. Therefore, the problem of implementing the projects and carrying out on the promise is a real issue so far as India is concerned. I would add to it that for India this is also concerned, and I'll take Shakya's argument further, that the problem partly is of the neighbors are leaning towards China. The major problem is that the Chinese are leaning towards South Asia. They want to get into South Asia for their own reasons, and I have no time to get into.
You know, they've already gotten into the Indian Ocean.
No, even besides the Indian Ocean, all the South Asian countries, from Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Maldives, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Nepal, and now Bhutan. So they want to get into South Asia, and imagine for a moment that even if Mr. Oli wants to distance himself from the Chinese, would the Chinese let him do so easily? Because they have invested a lot of political capital in Nepal, like in other countries, and a lot of economic capital. Look at the railroad, $8.4 billion. Now we have said we have also put in the railroad. Are we willing to put in that much money? Number one. Are we willing to complete it as fast as the Chinese have given the date, 2022? And Nepalese were asking for us to put the date on the Kathmandu rail projects, and we have shied away from putting the date because, you know, we may not be able to Now, this would show the Nepalese a very clear competition between India and China, and this is a challenge for India to accept it. The Nepalese said, if we get the hydropower projects done by the Chinese, you may have to buy that power, and India would find it very difficult to accept that proposition. So there are problems on both the sides, I would say. I mean, what Ambassador Mukerjee said, there are challenges on Mr. Oli's side. I am sure there are challenges on Delhi's side also. And whether these two sides can come out of the rigmarole of policies which have been carried out. I mean, all said and done, we have messed up policies in Nepal, as in many other countries. Will we be able to think that, okay, we have to give lot of scope and space to these countries to develop their own ways? These are the challenges, and therefore I find it very difficult, but I wish that they do not fail. At least they succeed partially, because that would restore the trust and confidence in each other, and the kind of reservations which exist today would be diluted, if not completely eliminated.
Sure. Ambassador, a couple of questions as far as the relationship itself is concerned. Nepal is sandwiched between India and China. So KP Oli's options seem to be limited. How can he strike a balancing act going forward between India and China, two big neighbors on either side? And, let's first get that out of the way, and then we'll talk about the next question.
Well, that's obviously in the current state of affairs one of the most important questions. China is looking at it from the Indian side, the elephant in the room, not just in Nepal, but in virtually all our neighboring countries. It'll take too long a time to get into all sorts of complex details. So let me put it very simply. We must treat Nepal as a sovereign country that has and therefore has the authority as a sovereign country to make its own choices. If Nepal wants to have productive, cooperative relationship with China, if Nepal wants to have economic relations with China, regardless of the whatever difficulties it poses in the way, if it wants to accept Chinese aid and so on and so forth, then that is Nepal's right. We should not fall into the trap of if all this talk about Nepal playing the China card, if we insist on a kind of competitive politics within Nepal, relationship with Nepal that is competing with the Chinese involvement in Nepali economy or its polity or whatever, we are falling into that trap. We are happily situated in terms of our relationship with Nepal geographically, culturally, historically, and so on.
But that's not enough. That's what the Nepalese are saying.
It is more than enough, I would say, because we are dealing, as I said, with a sovereign country. We should make it very clear that we are not there to interfere in Nepal's internal dynamics, internal political setup. There are certain things in which our security is concerned. For instance, during the time of the Madheshi agitation, on this channel, I said what our leaders were saying, that if there is unrest in the Madhesh, it spills over into India. That is a legitimate cause for us to express our concern. That is not interference. In fact, more than half the time when the Nepal government has approached India to do certain things which they then complain is interference when we accept doing it. So we have to walk a tightrope there. What I'm saying is there is a genuine need to, as the joint statement said, that's not rhetorical, to treat Nepal with mutual respect, both countries to treat each other with mutual respect for their sovereignty.
Sure.
So this whole question of tailoring our policy vis-a-vis the Chinese sort of encroachments into Nepal space is a self-defeating measure. We have a lot of things to do in Nepal which stand on their own feet.
Right.
We should do them. We should do them well. We should do them in time, and the rest will follow. Privately, and this need not come into the public domain, this is part of diplomacy, we should also make it very clear to Nepal that there are certain red lines. One of them is that, and I don't want to go into detail, that please do not let your soil be used for any activity by the Chinese or anyone else, including Pakistan or whatever, that are inimical to India's security interests.
Sure,
this is something that the Nepali people will understand. This is something that has been, communications between the two countries have been active in this sphere, and this needs to be stressed. Apart from that, apart from our security interests with which we should have a quiet but active dialogue with Nepal, pointing out certain things which would not be acceptable to us. For the rest of it, we have a huge number of areas where we are actively involved in Nepal, which we should carry on, especially the area of development cooperation.
Sure.
And as I said, we should, unlike the past, do it efficiently and do it in a timely fashion.
All right, Mallika, quick closing comment from you about what's the way forward for the relationship between India and Nepal?
Well, maybe to capitalize on the stability that is inside, that hasn't been inside for really a long time. And I would like to compare maybe the 1990 moment when we had a new constitution and now, we just had another new constitution, is that at that time, the world was going through a neoliberal wave. And so when Nepal democratized, it very quickly became a kind of a good example of a case study of a neoliberal state. And I think what Nepal is doing now through the civil war and then the post-civil war kind of dialogues and reconciliations between various parties and ideologies within the country is a kind of a reversal of that and find a way for itself as a developmental, democratic and a country that is deeply respectful of social justice within itself. And these are great achievements, and that is largely associated with the formation of the new states or the global wave of the 1960s when all countries went through that, India, rest of South Asia. So I feel that this is a great, second great opportunity for Nepal, and it might be useful for the country to be given a benefit of doubt and maybe a certain honeymoon period to kind of see what would be the outcome of this new, the end of the transition from the rest of its neighbors, I think.
All right. On that note, then we'll call it a wrap on this edition of India's World. I'd like to thank all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. As usual, you can share your feedback and suggestions with us. Our email ID is indiasworld.feedback@gmail.com. You can also tweet to us using our Twitter handles at FRP09 and at Rajya Sabha TV. That's it from me. See you again next time.